The Problem of Increasing Human Energy, with special references to the harnessing of the sun's energy, by Nikola Tesla. Century Illustrated Magazine, June 1900. The onward movement of man, the energy of the movement, the three ways of increasing human energy. Of all the endless variety of phenomena which nature presents to our senses, there is none that fills our mind with greater wonder than that inconceivably complex movement which, in its entirety, we designate as human life. Its mysterious origin is veiled in the forever impenetrable mist of the past. Its character is rendered incomprehensible by its infinite intricacy, and its destination is hidden in the unfathomable depths of the future. Hence, where does it come from? What is it? Whither does it tend? Are the great questions which the sages of all time have endeavored to answer. Modern science says, the sun is the past, the earth is the present, the moon is the future. From an incandescent mass we have originated, and into a frozen mass we shall turn. Merciless is the law of nature, and rapidly and irresistibly we are drawn to our doom. Lord Kelvin, in his profound meditations, allows us only a short span of life, something like 6 million years, after which time the sun's bright light will have ceased to shine, and its life-giving heat will have ebbed away, and our own earth will be a lump of ice, hurrying on through the eternal night. But do not let us despair. There will still be left upon a glimmering spark of life, and there will be a chance to kindle a new fire on some distant star. This wonderful possibility seems, indeed, to exist, judging from Professor Dewar's beautiful experiments with liquid air, which show that germs of organic life are not destroyed by cold, no matter how intense. Consequently, they may be transmitted through the interstellar space. Meanwhile, the cheering lights of science and art, ever increasing in intensity, illuminate our paths, and marvels they disclose, and the enjoyments they offer make us measurably forgetful of the gloomy future. Though we may never be able to comprehend human life, we know certainly that it is a movement, of whatever nature it be. The existence of movement unavoidably implies a body which is being moved and a force which is moving it. Hence, wherever there is life, there is a mass moved by a force. All mass possesses inertia, all force tends to persist. Owing to this universal property and condition, a body, be it at rest or in motion, tends to remain in the same state, and the force, manifesting itself anywhere and through whatever cause, produces an equivalent opposing force. And as an absolute necessity of this, it follows that every movement in nature must be rhythmical. Long ago, this simple truth was clearly pointed out by Herbert Spencer, who arrived at it through a somewhat different process of reasoning. It is borne out in everything we perceive, in the movement of a planet, in the surging of the ebbing of the tide, in the reverberations of the air, the swinging of a pendulum, the oscillations of an electrical current, and in the infinitely varied phenomena of organic life. Does not the whole of human life attest to it? Birth, growth, old age, and death of an individual, family, race, or nation. What is it all but a rhythm? All life manifestation, then, even in its most intricate form, as exemplified in man, is only a movement to which the same general laws of movement which govern throughout the physical universe must be applicable. Colorado Spring Notes, page 334, photograph X, figure 1, burning the nitrogen of the atmosphere. Note to figure 1. This result is produced by the discharge of an electrical oscillator giving 12 million volts. The electrical pressure, alternating 100,000 times per second, excites the normally inert nitrogen, causing it to combine with oxygen. The flame-like discharge shown in the photograph measures 65 feet across. When we speak of man, we have a conception of humanity as a whole, and before applying scientific methods to the investigation of his movement, we must accept this as a physical fact. But anyone can doubt today that all the millions of individuals and all the innumerable types and characters constitute an entity, a unit. But can anyone doubt today that all millions of individuals, all the innumerable types and characters constitute an entity, a unit? Though free to think and act, we are held together, like the stars in the firmament, with the ties inseparable. These ties cannot be seen, but we could feel them. I cut myself in the finger, and it pains me. This finger is a part of me. I see a friend hurt and it hurts me too. My friend and I are one. And now I see a stricken down enemy, a lump of matter which, of all the lumps of matter in the universe, I care least for, and it still grieves me. Does this not prove that each of us is only part of a whole? For ages, this idea has been proclaimed in the consummately wise teachings of religion, probably not alone as a means of ensuring peace and harmony among men, but as a deeply founded truth. The Buddhist expresses it in one way, the Christian in another. Both say the same, we are all one. Metaphysical proofs are, however, not the only ones which we are able to bring forth in support of this idea. Science too recognizes this connectedness of separate individuals, though not quite in the same sense as it admits that the suns, planets, and moons of a constellation are one body, and there could be no doubt that it will be experimentally confirmed in times to come when our means and methods for investigating physical and other states and phenomena shall have been brought to great perfection. Still more, this one human being lives on and on. The individual is ephemeral. Races and nations come and pass away, but man remains. Therein lies the profound difference between the individual and the whole. Therein too is to be found the partial explanation of many of those marvelous phenomena of heredity, which are the result of countless centuries of feeble but persistent influence. Conceive then man as a mass urged on by a force. Though this movement is not of translatory character implying change of place, yet the general laws of mechanical movement are applicable to it, and the energy associated with this mass can be measured in accordance with the well-known principles by the half product of the mass with the square of a certain velocity. So, for instance, a cannonball which is at rest possesses a certain amount of energy in the form of heat, which we measure in a similar way. We imagine the ball to consist of innumerable minute particles, called atoms or molecules, which vibrate or whirl around one another. We determine their masses and velocities, and from them the energy of each of these minute systems, and adding them all together, we get an idea of the total heat energy contained in the ball, which is only seemingly at rest. In this purely theoretical estimate, this energy may then be calculated by multiplying half of the total mass, that is, half of the sum of all the small masses, with the square of a velocity, which is determined from the velocities of the separate particles. In like manner, we may conceive of human energy being measured by half the human mass multiplied with the square of the velocity, which we are not yet able to compute. But our deficiency in this knowledge will not vitiate the truth of the deductions I shall draw, which rest on the firm basis that the same laws of mass and force govern throughout nature. Man, however, is not an ordinary mass consisting of spinning atoms and molecules and containing merely heat energy. He is a mass possessed of certain higher qualities by reason of the creative principle of life with which he is endowed. His mass, as the water in an ocean wave, is being continuously exchanged, new taking the place of the old. Not only this, but he grows, propagates, and dies, thus altering his mass independently, both in bulk and density. What is most wonderful of all, he is capable of increasing or diminishing his velocity of movement by the mysterious power he possesses by appropriating more or less energy from other substance and turning it into motive energy. But in any given moment, we may ignore these slow changes and assume that human energy is measured by half the product of man's mass with the square of a certain hypothetical velocity. However, we may compute this velocity, and whatever we may take as the standard of its measure, we must, in harmony with this conception, come to the conclusion that this great problem of science is, and always will be, to increase the energy thus defined. Many years ago, stimulated by the perusal of that deeply interesting work, Draper's History of the Intellectual Development of Europe, depicting so vividly human movement, I recognized that to solve this eternal problem must ever be the chief task of the man of science. Some results of my own effort to this end I shall endeavor briefly to describe here. Diagram A, the 3 ways of increasing human energy. Let then, in diagram A, M represent the mass of man. The mass is impelled in one direction by a force F, which is resisted by another partly frictional and partly negative force R, acting in a direction exactly opposite and retarding the movement of the mass. Such an antagonistic force is present in every movement and must be taken into consideration. The difference between these two forces is the effective force which imparts a velocity v to the mass m in the direction of the arrow on the line representing the force F. In accordance with the preceding, the human energy will be given by the product mv squared, in which m is the total mass of man in the ordinary interpretation of the term mass, and v is a certain hypothetical velocity, which, in the present state of science, we are unable exactly to define and determine. To increase the human energy is, therefore, equivalent to increasing this product, and there are, as readily be seen, only three ways possible to attain this result, which are illustrated in the above diagram. The first way, shown in the top figure, is to increase the mass, as indicated by the dotted circle, leaving the two opposing forces the same. The second way is to reduce the retarding force R to a smaller value R, leaving the mass and the impelling force the same, as diagrammatically shown in the middle figure. The third way, which is illustrated in the last figure, is to increase the impelling force F to a higher value F, while the mass and the retarding force R remain unaltered. Evidently, fixed limits exist as regards increase of mass and reduction of retarding force, but the impelling force can be increased indefinitely. Each of these three possible solutions presents a different aspect of the main problem of increasing human energy, which is thus divided into three distinct problems to be successfully considered. The first problem, how to increase the human mass, the burning of atmospheric nitrogen. Viewed generally, there are obviously two ways of increasing the mass of mankind. First, by aiding and maintaining those forces and conditions which tend to increase it. And second, by opposing and reducing those which tend to diminish it. The mass will be increased by careful attention to health, by substantial food, by moderation, by regularity of habits, by promotion of marriage, by conscientious attention to children, and generally stated, by the observance of all the many precepts and laws of religion and hygiene. But in adding new mass to the old, three cases again present themselves. Either the mass is added of the same velocity as the old, or it is of smaller or of a higher velocity. To gain an idea of the relative importance of these cases, imagine a train composed of, say, 100 locomotives running on a track. And suppose that, to increase the energy of the moving mass, 4 more locomotives are added to the train. If these 4 move at the same velocity at which the train is going, the total energy will be increased 4%. If they are moving at only half of that velocity, the increase will amount to only 1%. If they are moving at twice that velocity, the increase of energy will be 16%. This simple illustration shows that it is of greatest importance to add mass of a higher velocity. Stated more to the point, if, for example, the children be of the same degree of enlightenment as the parents, that is, mass of the same velocity, the energy will simply increase proportionally to the number added. If they are less intelligent or advanced, or mass of smaller velocity, there will be a very slight gain in the energy. But if they are further advanced, or mass of higher velocity, then the new generation will add very considerably to the sum total of human energy. Any addition of mass of smaller velocity beyond that indispensable amount required by the law expressed in the proverb, mens sana in corpore sano, should be strenuously opposed. For instance, the mere development of muscle as aimed in some of our colleges, I consider equivalent to adding mass of smaller velocity, and I would not commend it, although my views were different when I was a student myself. Moderate exercise, ensuring the right balance between mind and body, and the highest efficiency of performance is, of course, a prime requirement. The above example shows that the most important result to be attained is the education or the increase of the velocity of the mass newly added. Conversely, it scarcely need be stated that everything that is against the teachings of religion and the laws of hygiene is tending to decrease the mass. Whiskey, wine, tea, coffee, tobacco, and other such stimulants are responsible for the shortening of the lives of many and ought to be used with moderation. But I do not think that rigorous measures of suppressions of habits followed through many generations are commendable. It is wiser to preach moderation than abstinence. We have become accustomed to these stimulants, and if such reforms are to be effected, they must be slow and gradual. Those who are devoting their energies to such ends could make themselves far more useful by turning their efforts in other directions, as, for instance, towards providing pure water. For every person who perishes from the effects of a stimulant, at least 1,000 die from the consequences of drinking impure water. This precious fluid, which daily infuses new life into us, is likewise the chief vehicle through which disease and death enter our bodies. The germs of destruction it conveys are enemies all the more terrible as they perform their fatal work unperceived. They seal our doom while we live and enjoy. The majority of people are so ignorant or careless in drinking water, and the consequences of this are so disastrous that a philanthropist can scarcely use his efforts better than by endeavoring to enlighten those who are thus injuring themselves. By systematic purification and sterilization of the drinking water, the human mass would be very considerably increased. It should be made a rigid rule, which might be enforced by law, to boil or to sterilize otherwise the drinking water in every household and public place. The mere filtering does not afford sufficient security against infection. All ice for internal usage should be artificially prepared from water thoroughly sterilized. The importance of eliminating germs of disease from the city water is generally recognized, but little is being done to improve the existing conditions, as no satisfactory method of sterilizing great quantities of water has yet been brought forward. By improved electrical appliances, we are now enabled to produce ozone cheaply and in large amounts, and this ideal disinfectant seems to offer a happy solution of the important question. Gambling, business rush, and excitement, particularly on the exchanges, are causes of mass reduction, all the more so because the individuals concerned represent units of higher value. Incapacity of observing the first symptoms of an illness and careless neglect of the same are important factors of mortality. In noting carefully every new sign of approaching danger and making conscientiously every possible effort to avert it, we are not only following wise laws of hygiene in the interest of our well-being and the success of our labors, but we are also complying with a higher moral duty. Everyone should consider his body as a priceless gift from one whom he loves above all, as a marvelous work of art, of indiscernible beauty and mastery beyond human conception, and so delicate and frail that a word, a breath, a look, nay, a thought may injure it. Uncleanliness, which breeds disease and death, is not only a self-destructive but highly immoral habit. In keeping our bodies free from infection, healthful and pure, we are expressing our reverence for the high principle with which they are endowed. He who follows the precepts of hygiene in this spirit is proving himself so far truly religious. Laxity of morals is a terrible evil, which poisons both mind and body, and which is responsible for a great reduction of the mass in some countries. Many of the present customs and tendencies are productive of similar hurtful results. For example, the society life, modern education, and pursuits of women, tending to draw them away from their household duties and make men out of them, must needs distract from the elevating ideal they represent, diminish the artistic creative power, and cause sterility and a general weakening of the race. 1,000 other evils might be mentioned, but all put together, and their bearing upon the problem under discussion, they could not equal a single one: the want of food brought on by poverty, destitution, and famine. Millions of individuals die yearly for want of food, thus keeping down the mass. Even in our enlightened communities, and notwithstanding the many charitable effort, this is still, in all probability, the chief evil. I do not mean here absolute want of food, but want of healthful nutriment. How to provide good and plentiful food is, therefore, a most important question of the day. On the general principles, the raising of cattle as a means of providing food is objectionable, because, in the sense interpreted above, it must undoubtedly tend to the addition of mass of a smaller velocity. It is certainly preferable to raise vegetables, and I think therefore that vegetarianism is a commendable departure from the established barbarous habit. That we can subsist on plant food and perform our work even to advantage is not a theory, but a well-demonstrated fact. Many races living almost exclusively on vegetables are of superior physique and strength. There is no doubt that some plant food, such as oatmeal, is more economical than meat and superior to it in regard to both mechanical and mental performance. Such food, moreover, taxes our digestive organs decidedly less, and in making us more contented and sociable, produces an amount of good difficult to estimate. In view of these facts, every effort should be made to stop the wanton of cruel slaughter of animals, which must be destructive to our morals. To free ourselves from animal instincts and appetites which keep us down, we should begin at the very root from which we spring. We should effect a radical reform in the character of the food. There seems to be no philosophical necessity for food. We can conceive of organized beings living without nourishment and deriving all the energy they need from the performance of their life functions from the ambient medium. In a crystal, we have the clear evidence of the existence of a formative life principle, and though we cannot understand the life of a crystal, it is nonetheless a living being. There may be, besides crystals, other such individualized material systems of being, perhaps of gaseous constitution, or composed of substance still more tenuous. In view of this possibility, nay, probability, we cannot apodictically deny the existence of organized beings on a planet merely because the conditions on the same are unsuitable for the existence of life as we conceive it. We cannot even, with positive assurance, assert that some of them might not be present here, in this our world, in the very midst of us, for their constitution and life manifestation may be such that we are unable to perceive them. The production of artificial food as a means for causing an increase of the human mass naturally suggests itself, but a direct attempt of this kind to provide nourishment does not appear to me rational, at least not for the present. Whether we could thrive on such food is very doubtful. We are the result of ages of continuous adaptation, and we cannot radically change without unforeseen and in all probability disastrous consequences. So uncertain an experiment should not be tried. By far the best way, it seems to me, to meet the ravages of the evil would be to find ways of increasing the productivity of the soil. With this object, the preservation of forests is of an importance which cannot be overestimated, and in this connection, also, the utilization of water power for purposes of electrical transmission, dispensing in many ways with the necessity of burning wood, and tending thereby to forest preservation is to be strongly advocated. But there are limits in the improvement to be effected in this and similar ways. To increase materially the productivity of the soil, it must be more effectively fertilized by artificial means. The question of food production resolves itself then into the question how best to fertilize the soil. What is it that made the soil still a mystery? To explain its origin is probably equivalent to explaining the origin of life itself. The rocks, disintegrated by moisture and heat and wind and weather, were in themselves not capable of maintaining life. Some unexplained condition arose, and some new principle came into effect, and the first layer capable of sustaining low organisms like mosses was formed. These, by their life and death, added more of their life-sustaining quality to the soil, and higher organisms could then subsist, and so on, until at last highly developed plant and animal life could flourish. But though these theories are, even now, not in agreement as to how fertilization is effective, it is a fact only too well ascertained that the soil cannot indefinitely sustain life, and some way must be found to supply it with substances which have been abstracted from it by the plants. The chief and most valuable amongst these substances are compounds of nitrogen, and the cheap production of these is, therefore, the key for the solution of all important food production. Our atmosphere contains an inexhaustible amount of nitrogen, and could we but oxidize it and produce these compounds, an incalculable benefit for mankind would follow. Long ago, this idea took a powerful hold on the imagination of scientific men. But an efficient means for accomplishing this result could not be devised. The problem was rendered extremely difficult by the extraordinary inertness of the nitrogen, which refuses to combine even with oxygen. But here, electricity comes to our aid. The dormant affinities of the element are awakened by an electric current of the proper quality. as a lump of coal which has been in contact with oxygen for centuries without burning will combine with it when once ignited, so nitrogen excited by electricity will burn. I did not succeed, however, in producing electrical discharges exciting very effectively the atmospheric nitrogen until a comparatively recent date, although I showed in May 1891 in a scientific lecture a novel form of discharge or electrical flame named St. Elmo's hot fire, which besides being capable of generating ozone in abundance, also possessed, as I pointed out on that occasion, distinctively the quality of exciting chemical affinities. This discharge or flame was then only 3 or 4 inches long. Its chemical action was likewise very feeble, and consequently, the process of oxidation of nitrogen was wasteful. How to intensify this action was the question. Evidently, electrical currents of a peculiar kind had to be produced in order to render the process of nitrogen combustion more efficient. The first advance was made in ascertaining that the chemical activity of the discharge was very considerably increased by using currents of extremely high frequency or rate of vibration. This was an important improvement, but practical considerations soon set a definite limit to the progress in this direction. Next, the effects of the electrical pressure of the current impulses of their waveform and other characteristic features were investigated. Then, the influence of atmospheric pressure and temperature and of the presence of water and other bodies was studied, and thus the best conditions for causing the most intense chemical reaction of the discharge and securing the highest efficiency of the process were gradually ascertained. Naturally, the improvements were not quick in coming. Still, little by little I advanced. The flame grew larger and larger, and its oxidizing action grew more intense. From an insignificant brush discharge a few inches long, it developed into a marvelous electrical phenomenon, a roaring blaze, devouring the nitrogen of the atmosphere and measuring 60 or 70 feet across. Thus slowly, almost imperceptibly, possibility became accomplishment. All is not yet done, by any means. But to what a degree my efforts have been rewarded, an idea may be gained from an inspection of Figure 1, which, with its title, is self-explanatory. The flame-like discharge visible is produced by the intense electrical oscillations which pass through the coil shown and violently agitate the electrified molecules of the air. By this means, a strong affinity is created between the two normally indifferent constituents of the atmosphere, even if no further provision is made for intensifying the chemical action of the discharge. In the manufacture of nitrogen compounds by this method, of course, every possible means bearing upon the intensity of this action and the efficiency of this project will be taken advantage of. And, besides, special arrangements will be provided for the fixation of the compounds formed, as they are generally unstable, the nitrogen becoming again inert after a little lapse of time. Steam is a simple and effective means for fixing permanently the compounds. The result illustrated makes it practicable to oxidize the atmospheric nitrogen in unlimited quantities, merely by the use of cheap mechanical power and simple electrical apparatus. In this manner, many compounds of nitrogen may be manufactured all over the world at a small cost and in any desired amount, and by means of these compounds the soil can be fertilized and its productiveness indefinitely increased. An abundance of cheap and healthful food, not artificial, but such as we are accustomed to, may thus be obtained. This new and inexhaustible source of food supply will be of incalculable benefit to mankind, for it will enormously contribute to the increase of the human mass, and thus immensely adding to human energy. Soon, I hope, the world will see the beginning of an industry which, in time to come, will, I believe, be in importance next to that of iron. The second problem: how to reduce the force retarding the human mass, the art of tele-automatics. As before stated, the force which retards the onward movement of man is partly frictional and partly negative. To illustrate this distinction, I may name, for example, ignorance, stupidity, and imbecility as some of the purely frictional forces or resistances devoid of any directive tendency. On the other hand, visionaries, insanity, self-destructive tendency, religious fanaticism, and the like are all forces of a negative character, acting in definite directions. To reduce or entirely overcome these dissimilar retarding forces, radically different methods must be employed. One knows, for instance, what a fanatic may do, and one can take preventive measures, can enlighten, convince, and possibly direct him to turn his vice into virtue. But one does not know, and never can know, what a brute or an imbecile may do, and one must deal with him as with a mass, inert, without mind, let loose by the mad elements. A negative force always implies some quality, not infrequently a high one, though badly directed, which it is possible to turn to good advantage. But a directionless, frictionless force involves unavoidable loss. Evidently, then, the first and general answer to the above question is turn all negative force in the right direction and reduce all frictional force. There could be no doubt that, of all the frictional resistances, the one that most retards human movement is ignorance. Not without reason said that man of wisdom, Buddha, ignorance is the greatest evil in the world. The friction which results from ignorance, and which is greatly increased owing to the numerous languages and nationalities, can be reduced only by the spread of knowledge and the unification of the heterogeneous elements of humanity. No effort could be better spent. But however ignorance may have retarded the onward movement of man in times past, it is certain that, nowadays, negative forces have become of greater importance. Among these, there is one of far greater moment than any other. It is called organized warfare. When we consider the millions of individuals, often the ablest in mind and body, the flower of humanity, who are compelled to a life of inactivity and unproductiveness, the immense sums of money daily required for the maintenance of armies and war apparatus, representing ever so much of human energy, all the effort uselessly spent in the production of arms and implements of destruction, the loss of life and the fostering of a barbarous spirit, we are appalled at the inestimable loss to mankind which the existence of these deplorable conditions must involve. What can we do to combat best this great evil? Law and order absolutely require the maintenance of organized force. No community can exist and prosper without rigid discipline. Every country should be able to defend itself should the necessity arise. The conditions of today are not the result of yesterday, and a radical change cannot be effected tomorrow. If the nations would at once disarm, it is more than likely that a state of things worse than war itself would follow. Universal peace is a beautiful dream, but not at once realizable. We have seen recently that even the noble effort of the man invested with the greatest worldly power has been virtually without effect. And no wonder, for the establishment of universal peace is, for the time being, a physical impossibility. War is a negative force and cannot be turned in a positive direction without passing through the intermediate phases. It is a problem of making a wheel, rotating one way, turn in the opposite direction without slowing it down, stopping it, and speeding it up again the other way. It has been argued that the perfection of guns of great destructive power will stop warfare. So I myself thought for a long time, but now I believe this to be a profound mistake. Such developments will greatly modify but not arrest it. On the contrary, I think that every new arm that is invented, every new departure that is made in this direction merely invites new talent and skill, engages new effort, offers new incentive, and so only gives a fresh impetus to further development. Think of the discovery of gunpowder. Can we conceive of any more radical departure that was affected by this innovation? Let us imagine ourselves living in that period. Would we not have thought then that warfare was at an end, when the armor of the knight became an object of ridicule, when bodily strength and skill, meaning so much before, became of comparatively little value? Yet gunpowder did not stop warfare. Quite the opposite. It acted as a most powerful incentive. Nor do I believe that warfare can ever be arrested by any scientific or ideal development, so long as similar conditions to those prevailing now exist, because war has itself become a science, and because war involves some of the most sacred sentiments of which man is capable. In fact, it is doubtful whether men who would not be ready to fight for a high principle would be good for anything at all. It is not the mind which makes man, nor it is the body. It is mind and body. Our virtues and our failings are inseparable, like force and matter. When they separate, man is no more. Another argument which carries considerable force is frequently made, namely, that war must soon become impossible because the means of defense are outstripping the means of attack. This is only in accordance with a fundamental law which may be expressed by the statement that it is easier to destroy than to build. This law defines human capacities and human conditions. Were these such that it would be easier build than to destroy, man go on unrested, creating and accumulating without limits. Such conditions are not of this earth. A being which could do this, not be a man, it may be a god. Defense will always have the advantage over attack, but this alone, it seems to me, can never stop war. By the use of new principles of defense, we can render harbors impregnable against attack, but we cannot by such means prevent two warships meeting in battle on the high sea. And then, if we follow this idea to its ultimate development, we are led to the conclusion that it would be better for mankind if attack and defense were just oppositely related. For if every country, even the smallest, could surround itself with a wall absolutely impenetrable and could defy the rest of the world, a state of things would surely be brought on which would be extremely unfavorable to human progress. It is by abolishing all the barriers which separate nations and countries that civilization is best furthered. Again, it is contended by some that the advent of the flying machine must bring on universal peace. This too I believe to be an entirely erroneous view. The flying machine is certainly coming, and very soon, but the conditions will remain the same as before. In fact, I see no reason why a ruling power like Great Britain might not govern the air as well as the sea. Without wishing to put myself on record as a prophet, I do not hesitate to say that the next years we will see the establishment of an air power, and its center may not be far from New York. But for all that, men will fight on merrily. The ideal development of the war principle will ultimately lead to the transformation of the whole energy of war into purely potential explosive energy like that of an electrical condenser. In this form, the war energy could be maintained without effort. It would need to be much smaller in amount while incomparably more effective. As regards the security of a country against foreign invasion, it is interesting to note that it depends only on the relative and not the absolute number of the individuals or magnitude of the forces, and that if every country should reduce the war force in the same ratio, the security would remain unaltered. An international agreement with the object of reducing to a minimum the war force which, in view of the still imperfect education of the masses, is absolutely indispensable, would therefore seem to be the first rational step to take towards diminishing the force retarding human movement. Fortunately, the existing conditions cannot continue indefinitely, for a new element is beginning to assert itself. A change for the better is imminent, and I shall now endeavor to show what, according to my ideas, will be the first advance towards the establishment of peaceful relations between nations, and by what means it will eventually be accomplished. Let us go back to the early beginning, when the law of the stronger was the only law. The light of reason was not yet kindled, and the weak was entirely at the mercy of the strong. The weak individual then began to learn how to defend himself. He made use of a club, stone, spear, sling, or bow and arrow, and in the course of time, instead of physical strength, intelligence became the chief deciding factor in the battle. The wild character was gradually softened by the awakening of noble sentiments, and so, imperceptibly, after ages of continued progress, we have come from the brutal fight of the unreasoning animal to what we call the civilized warfare of today, in which the combatants shake hands, talk in a friendly way, and smoke cigars, ready to engage again in deadly conflict at a signal. Let pessimists say what they like. Here is an absolute evidence of great and gratifying advance. But now, what is the next phase in this evolution? Not peace as yet, by any means. The next change which should naturally follow from modern developments should be the continuous diminution of the number of individuals engaged in battle. The apparatus will be of specifically great power, but only a few individuals will be required to operate it. This evolution will bring more and more into prominence a machine or mechanism with the fewest individuals as an element of warfare. And the absolutely unavoidable consequences of this will be the abandonment of large, clumsy, slowly moving, and unimaginable units. Greatest possible speed and maximum rate of energy delivery by the war apparatus will be the main object. The loss of life will become smaller and smaller, and finally, the number of the individuals continuously diminishing. Merely machines will meet in a contest without bloodshed, the nations being simply interested, ambitious spectators. When this happy condition is realized, peace will be assured. But no matter to what degree of perfection rapid-fire guns, high-powered cannon, explosive projectiles, torpedo boats, or other implements of war may be brought, no matter how destructive they may be, that condition could never be reached through any such development. All such implements require men for their operation. Men are indispensable, parts of the machinery. Their object is to kill and to destroy. Their power resides in their capacity for doing evil. So long as men meet in battle, there will be bloodshed. Bloodshed will ever keep up barbarous passion. To break this fierce spirit, a radical departure must be made, an entirely new principle must be introduced, something that never existed before in warfare. A principle which will forcibly, unavoidably turn the battle into a mere spectacle, a play, a contest without loss of blood. To bring on this result, men must be dispensed with. Machine must fight machine. But how accomplish that which seems impossible? The answer is simple enough. Produce a machine capable of acting though it were part of a human being. No mere mechanical contrivance, comprising levers, screws, wheels, clutches, and nothing more, but a machine embodying a higher principle, which will enable it to perform its duties as though it had intelligence, experience, judgment, a mind. This conclusion is the result of my thoughts and observations, which have extended through virtually my whole life, and I shall now briefly describe how I came to accomplish that which at first seemed an unrealizable dream. A long time ago, when I was a boy, I was afflicted with a singular trouble, which seems to have been due to an extraordinary excitability of the retina. It was the appearance of images which, by their persistence, marred the vision of real objects and interfered with thought. When a word was said to me, the image of the object which it designated would appear vividly before my eyes, and many times it was impossible for me to tell whether the object I saw was real or not. This caused me great discomfort and anxiety, and I tried hard to free myself of the spell, but for a long time I tried in vain, and it was not, as I clearly recollect, until I was about 12 years old that I succeeded for the first time, by an effort of the will, in banishing an image which presented itself. My happiness will never be as complete as it was then, but unfortunately, as I thought at that time, the old trouble returned, and with it my anxiety. Here it was that the observations to which I refer began. I noted, namely, that whenever the image of an object appeared before my eyes, I had seen something that reminded me of it. In the first instances, I thought this to be purely accidental, but soon I convinced myself that it was not so. A visual impression, consciously or unconsciously received, invariably preceded the appearance of the image. Gradually, the desire arose in me to find out, every time, what caused the images to appear, and the satisfaction of this desire soon became a necessity. The next observation I made was that, just as these images followed as a result of something I had seen, so also the thoughts which I conceived were suggested in like manner. Again, I experienced the same desire to locate the image which caused the thought, and this search for the original visual impression soon grew to be a second nature. My mind became automatic, as it were, and in the course of years of continued, almost unconscious performance, I acquired the ability of locating every time and, as a rule, instantly the visual impression which started the thought. Nor is this all. It was not long before I was aware that also all my movements were prompted in the same way, and so searching, observing, and verifying continuously year by year, I have, by every thought and every act of mine, demonstrated and do so daily to my absolute satisfaction that I am an automation endowed with power of movement, which merely responds to external stimuli beating upon my sense organs, and thinks and acts and moves accordingly. I remember only one or two cases in all my life in which I was unable to locate the first impression which prompted a movement or a thought, or even a dream. Figure 2. The first practical teleautomation. A machine having all the bodily or translatory movements and the operation of the interior mechanism controlled from a distance without wires. The crewless boat shown in the photograph contains its own motive power, propelling and steering machinery, and numerous other accessories, all of which are controlled by transmitting from a distance, without wires, electrical oscillations to a circuit carried by the boat and adjusted to respond only to these oscillators. With these experiences, it was only natural that, long ago, I conceived the idea of constructing an automaton which would mechanically represent me and which would respond as I do myself, but, of course, in a much more primitive manner to external influences. Such an automaton evidently had to have motive power, organs for locomotion, directive organs, and one or more sensitive organs so adapted as to be excited by external stimuli. This machine would, I reason, perform its movements in the manner of a living being, for it would have all the chief mechanical characteristics or elements of the same. There was still the capacity for growth, propagation, and above all, the mind which would be wanting to make the model complete. But growth was not necessary in the case since a machine could be manufactured full grown, so to speak. As to the capacity for propagation, it could likewise be left out of consideration, for in the mechanical model, it merely signified a process to manufacture. Whether the automation be of flesh and bone or of wood and steel, it mattered little, provided it could perform all the duties required of it like an intelligent being. To do so, it had to have an element corresponding to the mind, which would affect the control of all its movements and operation and cause it to act in any unforeseen case that might present itself with knowledge, reason, judgment, and experience. But this element I could easily embody in it by conveying to it my own intelligence, my own understanding. So this invention was evolved, and so a new art came into existence, for which the name tele-automatics has been suggested, which means controlling the movements and operations of distant automatons. This principle evidently was applicable to any kind of machine that moves on land or in the water or in the air. In applying it practically for the first time, I selected a boat. See Figure 2. A storage battery placed within it furnished the motive power. The propeller driven by a motor represented the locomotive organs. The rudder, controlled by another motor likewise driven by the battery, took the place of the directive organs. As to the sensitive organ, obviously the first thought was to utilize a device responded to rays of light like a selenium cell to represent the human eye. But upon closer inquiry, I find out, owing to experimental and other difficulties, no thoroughly satisfactory control of automaton could be affected by light, radiant heat, Hertzian radiations, or by rays in general, that is, disturbances which pass in straight lines through space. One of the reasons was that any obstacle coming between the operator and the distant automaton would place it beyond his control. Another reason was that the sensitive device representing the eye would have to be in a definite position with respect to the distant controlling apparatus, and this necessity would impose great limitations in the control. Still, another and very important reason was that in using rays, it would be difficult, if not impossible, to give the automaton individual features or characteristics distinguishing it from other machines of this kind. Evidently, the automaton should respond only to an individual call, as a person responds to a name. Such considerations led me to conclude that the sensitive device of the machine should correspond to the ear rather than the eye of a human being, for in this case its actions could be controlled irrespective of intervening obstacles, regardless of its position relative to the distant controlling apparatus, and last but not least, it would remain deaf and unresponsive, like a faithful servant, to all calls but that of its master. These requirements made it imperative to use in the control of the automaton, instead of light or other rays, waves of disturbances which propagate in all directions through space, like sound, or which follow a path of least resistance, however curved. I attained the result aimed at by means of an electrical current placed within the boat and adjusted or tuned exactly to electrical vibrations of the proper kind transmitted to it from a distant electrical oscillator. This circuit, in responding, however feebly, to the transmitted vibration, affected magnets and other contrivances, through the medium of which were controlled the movements of the propeller and rudder, and also the operations of numerous other appliances. By the simple means described, the knowledge, experience, judgment, the mind, so to speak, of the distant operator were embodied in that machine, which was thus enabled to move and to perform all its operation with reason and intelligence. It behaved just like a blindfolded person obeying directions received through the ear. The automatons so far constructed had borrowed minds, so to speak, as each merely formed part of the distant operator who conveyed to it his intelligent orders. By this art is only in the beginning. I purpose to show you that, however impossible may now seem, an automaton may be contrived which will have its own mind. And by this I mean that it will be able, independent of any operator, left entirely to itself to perform, in response to external influences affecting its sensitive organs, a great variety of acts and operations as if it had intelligence. It will be able to follow a course laid out or to obey orders given far in advance. It will be capable of distinguishing between what it ought and what it ought not to do, and making experience, or otherwise stated, of recording impressions which will definitely affect its subsequent actions. In fact, I have already conceived such a plan. Although I evolved this invention many years ago and explained it to my visitors very frequently in my laboratory demonstrations, it was not until much later, long after I had perfected it, that it became known, when naturally enough it gave rise to much discussion and to sensational reports. But the true significance of this new art was not grasped by the majority, nor was the great force of the underlying principle recognized. As nearly as I could judge from the numerous comments which appeared, the results I had obtained were considered as entirely impossible. Even the few who were disposed to admit the practicability of the invention saw in it merely an automobile torpedo, which was to be used for the purpose of blowing up battleships, without doubtful success. The general impression was that I contemplated simply the steering of such a vessel by means of Hertzian or other rays. There are torpedoes steered electrically by wires, and there are means of communicating without wires, and the above was, of course, an obvious inference. I had accomplished nothing more than this. I should have made a small advance indeed, but the art I have evolved does not contemplate merely the change of direction of a moving vessel. It affords means of absolutely controlling in every respect all the innumerable translatory movements as well as the operations of the internal organs, no matter how many, of an individualized automaton. Criticisms to the effect that control the automaton could be interfered with were made by people who do not even dream of the wonderful results which could be accomplished by use of electrical vibrations. Criticisms to the effect that the control of the automaton could not be interfered with were made by people who do not even dream of the wonderful results which can be accomplished by the use of electrical vibrations. The world moves slowly and new truths are difficult to see. Certainly, by the use of this principle, an arm for attack as well as defense may be provided, of a destructiveness all the greater as the principle is applicable to submarine and aerial vessels. There is virtually no restrictions to the amount of explosives it can carry, or as to the distance at which it can strike, and failure is almost impossible. But the force of this new principle does not wholly reside in its destructiveness. Its advent introduces into warfare an element which never existed before, a fighting machine without men as a means of attack and defense. The continuous development in this direction must ultimately make war a mere contest of machines without men and without loss of life, a condition which would have been impossible without this new departure, and which, in my opinion, must be reached as preliminary to permanent peace. The future will either bear out or disprove these views. My idea on this subject has been put forth with deep conviction, but in a humble spirit. The establishment of permanent peace relations between nations would most effectively reduce the force retarding the human mass, and would be the best solution of this great human problem. But will the dream of universal peace ever be realized? Let us hope that it will. When all the darkness shall be dissipated by the light of science, when all the nations shall be merged into one, and patriotism shall be identical with religion, when there shall be one language, one country, one end, then the dream will have become a reality. The third problem: how to increase the force of accelerating the human mass, the harnessing of the sun's energy. Of all the three possible solutions of the main problem of increasing human energy, this is by far the most important to consider, not only because of its intrinsic significance, but also because of its intimate bearing on all the many elements and conditions which determine the movement of humanity. In order to process systematically, it would be necessary for me to dwell on all those considerations which have guided me from the outset in my efforts to arrive at the solution, and which have led me step by step to the results I shall now describe. As a preliminary study of the problem and analytical investigation such as I have made of the chief forces which determine the onward movement would be made of advantage, particularly in conveying an idea of that hypothetical velocity which, as explained in the beginning, is a measure of human energy. But to deal with this specifically here, as I would desire, would lead me far beyond the scope of the present subject. Suffice it to state that the resultant of all these forces is always in the direction of reason, which therefore determines at any time the direction of human movement. This is to say that every effort which is scientifically applied, rational, useful, or practical must be in the direction in which the mass is moving. The practical, rational man, the observer, the man of business, he who reasons, calculates, or determines in advance, carefully applies his effort so that when coming into effect, it will be in the direction of the movement, making it thus more efficient. And in this knowledge and ability lies the secret of his success. Every new fact discovered, every new experience or new element added to our knowledge and entering into the domain of reasons affects the same and, therefore, changes the directions of movement, which, however, must always take place along the resultant of all those efforts which, at the time, we designate as reasonable, that is, self-preserving, useful, profitable, or practical. These efforts concern our daily lives, our necessities and comforts, our works and business, and it is these which drive man onward. But looking at all this busy world about us, on all this complex mass as it daily throbs and moves, what is it but an immense clockwork driven by a spring? In the morning when we rise, we cannot fail to note that all the objects about us are manufactured by machinery. The water we use is lifted by steam power. The trains bring our breakfast from distant localities. The elevators in our dwelling in our office buildings, the cars that carry us there, all are driven by power. In all our daily errands and in our very life pursuit, we demand upon it. All the objects we see tell us of it. And when we return to our machine-made dwelling at night, lest we should forget it, all the material comforts of our home, our cheering stove and lamp, remind us of how much we depend on power. And when there is an accidental stoppage of the machinery, when the city is snowbound, or the life-sustaining movement otherwise temporarily arrested, we are affrighted to realize how impossible it would be for us to live the life we live without motive power. Motive power means work. To increase the force accelerating human movement means, therefore, to perform more work. So we find that the three possible solutions of the great problem of increasing human energy are answered by the three words: food, peace, work. Many a year I have thought and pondered, lost myself in speculations and theories, considering man as a mass moved by a force, viewing his inexplicable movement in the light of a mechanical one, and applying the simple principles of mechanics to the analysis of the same until I arrived at these solutions, only to realize that they were taught to me in early childhood. These three words sound the keynotes of the Christian religion, their scientific meaning and purpose now clear to me: food to increase the mass, peace to diminish the retarding force, and work to increase the force accelerating the human movement. These are the only three solutions which are possible of that great problem, and that all of them have one object, one end, namely to increase human energy. When we recognize this, we cannot help wondering how profoundly wise and scientific and how immensely practical the Christian religion is, and what a marked contrast it stands in the respect to other religions. It is unmistakably the result of a practical experiment and scientific observation which have extended through the ages, while other religions seem to be the outcome of merely abstract reasoning. Work, untiring effort, useful and accumulative, with periods of rest and recuperations aiming at higher efficiency, is its chief and ever-recurring command. Thus we are inspired by both Christianity and science to do our utmost towards increasing the performance of mankind. This most important of human problems I shall now specifically consider. The source of human energy, the three ways of drawing energy from the sun. First, let us ask, from where comes all this motive power? What is the spring that drives all? We see the ocean rise and fall, the rivers flow, the wind, rain, hail, and snow beat on our windows. The train and steamers come and go. We hear the rattling noise of carriages, the voices from the street. We feel, smell, and taste, and we think all of this. And all this movement, from the surging of the mighty ocean to that subtle movement concerned in our thought, has but one common cause. All this energy emanates from one single center, one single source, the sun. The sun is the spring that drives all. The sun maintains all human life and supplies all human energy. Another answer we have now found to the above great question. To increase the force accelerating human movement means to turn to the uses of man more of the sun's energy. We honor and revere those great men of bygone times whose names are linked with immortal achievements, who have pondered themselves benefactors of humanity. The religious reformer with his wise maxims of life, the philosopher with his deep truths, the mathematician with his formula, the physicist with his laws, the discoverer with his principles and secrets wrested from nature, the artist with his forms of the beautiful. But who honors him, the greatest of all? Who could tell the name of him? Who first used the sun's energy to save the effort of a weak fellow creature? That was man's first act of scientific philanthropy, and its consequences have been incalculable. From the very beginning, 3 ways of drawing energy from the sun were open to man. The savage, when he warmed his frozen limbs at a fire kindled in some way, availed himself of the energy of the sun stored in the burning material. When he carried a bundle of branches to his cave and burned them there, he made use of the sun's stored energy transported from one to another locality. When he set sail to his canoe, he utilized the energy of the sun applied to the atmosphere of the ambient medium. There could be no doubt that the first is the oldest way. A fire, found accidentally, taught the savage to appreciate its beneficial heat. He then very likely conceived of the idea of carrying the glowing members to his abode. Finally, he learned to use the force of a swift current of water or air. It is characteristic of modern development that progress has been effected in the same order. The utilization of the energy stored in wood or coal, or generally speaking, fuel, led to the steam engine. Next, a great stride in advance was made in energy transportation by the use of electricity, which permitted the transfer of energy from one locality to another without transporting the material. But as to the utilization of energy of the ambient medium, no radical step forward has as yet been made known. The ultimate results of development in these 3 directions are, first, the burning of coal by a cold process in a battery; second, the efficient utilization of the energy of the ambient medium; and third, the transmission without wires of electrical energy to any distance. In whatever way these results may be arrived at, their practical application will necessarily involve an extensive use of iron, and this invaluable metal will undoubtedly be an essential element in the further development along these 3 lines. If we succeed in burning coal by a cold process and thus obtain electrical energy in an efficient and inexpensive manner, we shall require in many practical uses of this energy electrical motors, that is, iron. If we are successful in deriving energy from the ambient medium, we shall need both in obtainment and utilization of the energy, machinery, again, iron. We shall need both in the obtainment and utilization of the energy, machinery, again, iron. If we realize the transmission of electrical energy without wires on an industrial scale, we shall be compelled to use extensively electric generators. Once more, iron. Whatever we may do, iron will probably be the chief means of accomplishment in the near future, possibly more so than in the past. How long its reign will last is difficult to tell, for even now aluminum is looming up as a threatening competitor. But for the time being, next to providing new resources of energy, it is of the greatest importance to making improvements in the manufacture and utilization of iron. Great advances are possible in these latter directions, which, if brought about, would enormously increase the useful performance of mankind. Great possibilities offered by iron for increasing human performance. Enormous waste in iron manufacture. Iron is by far the most important factor in modern progress. It contributes more than any other industrial product to the force accelerating human movement. So general is the use of this metal, and so intimately is it connected with all that concerns our life, that it has become as indispensable to us as the very air we breathe. Its name is as synonymous with usefulness, but however great the influence of iron may be on the present human development, it does not add to the force urging man onward nearly as much as it might. First of all, its manufacture as now carried on is connected with an appalling waste of fuel, that is, waste of energy. Then again, only a part of all that iron produced is applied for useful purposes. A good part of it goes to create frictional resistances, while still another large part is the means of developing negative forces greatly retarding human movement. Thus, the negative force of war is almost wholly represented in iron. It is impossible to estimate with any degree of accuracy the magnitude of this greatest of all retarding forces, but it is certainly very considerable. If the present positive impelling force due to all useful applications of iron be represented by 10, for instance, I should not think it an exaggeration to estimate the negative force of war with due consideration of all its retarding influences and results at, say, 6. On the basis of this estimate, the effective impelling force of iron in the positive direction would be measured by the difference of these two numbers, which is 4. But if, through the establishment of universal peace, the manufacture of war machinery should cease, and all struggle for supremacy between nations should be turned into healthful, ever active, and productive commercial competition, then the positive impelling force due to iron would be measured by the sum of those two numbers, which is 16. That is, the force would have 4 times its present value. This example is, of course, merely intended to give an idea of the immense increase in the useful performance of mankind, which would result from a radical reform of the iron industries supplying the implements of warfare. A similar inestimable advantage in the saving of energy available to man would be secured by obviating the great waste of coal, which is inseparably connected with the present methods of manufacturing iron. In some countries, such as Great Britain, the hurtful effects of this squandering of fuel are beginning to be felt. The price of coal is constantly rising, and the poor are made to suffer more and more. Though we are still far from the dreaded exhaustion of the coal fields, philanthropy commands us to invent novel methods of manufacturing iron, which will not involve such barbarous waste of this valuable material from which we derive at present most of our energy. It is our duty to coming generations to leave this store of energy intact for them, or at least not to touch it until we shall have perfected processes for burning coal more efficiently. Those who are coming after us will need fuel more than we do. We should be able to manufacture the iron we require by using the sun's energy without wasting any coal at all. As an effort to this end, the idea of smelting iron ores by electric currents obtained from the energy of falling water has naturally suggested itself to many. I have, myself, spent much time in endeavoring to evolve such a practical process, which would enable iron to be manufactured at a small cost. After a prolonged investigation of the subject, finding that it was unprofitable to use the currents generated directly for smelting the ore, I devised a method which is far more economical. Economical production of iron by a new process. The industrial project, as I worked it out 6 years ago, contemplated the employment of the electric currents derived from the energy of a waterfall, not directly for smelting the ore, but for decomposing water for a preliminary step. To lessen the cost of the plant, I proposed to generate the currents in exceptionally cheap and simple dynamos, which I designed for this sole purpose. The hydrogen liberated in the electrolytic decomposition was to be burned or recombined with oxygen, not with that from which it was separated, but with that of the atmosphere. Thus, very nearly the total electrical energy used up in the decomposition of the water would be recovered in the form of heat, resulting from the recombination of the hydrogen. The heat was to be applied to the smelting ore. The oxygen gained as a byproduct of the decomposition of the water, I intended to use for certain industrial purposes, which would probably yield good financial returns inasmuch as this is the cheapest way of obtaining this gas in large quantities. In any event, It could be employed to burn all kinds of refuge, cheap hydrocarbon, or coal of the most inferior quality, which could not be burned in air or otherwise utilized to advantage, and thus again, a considerable amount of heat would be made available for the smelting of the ore. To increase the economy of the process, I contemplated furthermore using an arrangement such that the hot metal and the products of combustion coming out the furnace would give up their heat upon the cold ore going into the furnace, so that comparatively little of the heat energy would be lost in the smelting. I calculated that probably 40,000 pounds of iron could be produced per horsepower per annum by this method. Liberal allowances were made for those losses which were unavoidable, the above quantity being about half of that theoretically obtainable. Relying on this estimate and on practical data with reference to a certain kind of sand ore existing in abundance in the region of the Great Lakes, including cost of transportation and labor, I found that in some localities, iron could be manufactured in this manner cheaper than by any of the adopted methods. This result will be obtained all the more surely if the oxygen obtained from the water, instead of being used for smelting of ore, as assumed, should be more profitably employed. Any new demand for this gas would secure a high revenue for the plant, thus cheapening the iron. This project advanced merely in the interest of industry. Someday, I hope, a beautiful industrial butterfly will come out of the dusty and shriveled chrysalis. The production of iron from sand ores by a process of magnetic separation is highly commendable in principle, since it involves no waste of coal, but the usefulness of this method is largely reduced by the necessity of melting the iron afterward. As to the crushing of iron ore, I would consider it rational only if done by water power, or by energy otherwise obtained without consumption of fuel. An electrolytic cold process which would make it possible to extract iron cheaply and also to mold it into the required forms without any fuel consumption would, in my opinion, be a very great advance in iron manufacture. In common with some other metals, iron has so far resisted electrolytic treatment, but there could be no doubt that such a cold process will ultimately replace metallurgy, the present crude method of casting, and thus obviating the enormous waste of fuel necessitated by the repeated heating of metal in the foundries. Up to a few decades ago, the usefulness of iron was based almost wholly on its remarkable mechanical properties. But since the advent of the commercial dynamo and electric motor, its value to mankind has been greatly increased by its unique magnetic qualities. As regards the latter, iron has been greatly improved of late. The signal progress began about 13 years ago when I discovered that in using soft Bessemer steel instead of wrought iron, as then customary in an alternating motor, the performance of the machine was doubled. I brought this fact to the attention of Mr. Albert Schmid, to whose untiring efforts and ability is largely due to the supremacy of American electrical machinery, and who was then superintendent of an industrial corporation engaged in this field. Following my suggestion, he constructed transformers of steel and then showed the same marked improvement. The investigation was then systematically conditioned under Mr. Schmid's guidance, the impurities being gradually eliminated from the steel, which was only such a name, for in reality it was pure soft iron, and soon a product resulted which admitted of little further improvement. Transmission of electrical energy to any distance without wires, now practicable. The best means of increasing the force accelerating the human mass. The most valuable observation made in the course of these investigations was the extraordinary behavior of the atmosphere toward electrical impulses of excessive electromotive force. The experiment showed that the air at the ordinary pressure became distinctly conducting, and this opened up the wonderful prospect of transmitting large amounts of electrical energy for industrial purposes to great distance without wires, a possibility which, up to that time, was thought of only as a scientific dream. Further investigation revealed the important fact that the conductivity imparted to the air by these electrical impulses of many millions of volts increased very rapidly with the degree of rarefaction, so that air strata at very moderate altitudes, which are easily accessible, offer, to all experimental evidence, a perfect conducting path, better than copper wire, for currents of this character. Thus, the discovery of these new properties of the atmosphere not only opened up the possibility of transmitting, without wires, energy in large amounts, but, what was still more significant, it afforded the certitude that energy could be transmitted in this manner economically. In this new system, it matters little, in fact, almost nothing, whether the transmission is effected at a distance of a few miles or of a few thousand miles. While I have not, as of yet, actually effected a transmission of considerable amount of energy, such as would be of an industrial importance, to a great distance by this new method, I have operated several model plants under exactly the same conditions which will exist in a large plant of this kind, and the practicability of this system is thoroughly demonstrated. The experiments have shown conclusively that, with two terminals maintained at an elevation of no more than 30,000 to 35,000 feet above sea level, and with an electrical pressure of 15 to 20 million volts, the energy of thousands of horsepower can be transmitted over distances which may be hundreds and, if necessary, thousands of miles. I am hopeful, however, that I may be able to reduce very considerably the elevation of the terminals now required, and with this object I am following up an idea which promises such a realization. There is, of course, a popular prejudice against using an electrical pressure of millions of volts, which may cause sparks to fly at distances of hundreds of feet. But paradoxical as it may seem, the system, as I have described it in a technical publication, offers great personal safety than most of the ordinary distribution circuits now used in the cities. This is, in a measure, born out of the fact that, although I have carried on such experiments for a number of years, no injury has been sustained either by me or any of my assistants. But to enable a practical introduction of the system, a number of essential requirements are still to be fulfilled. It is not enough to develop appliances by means of which such a transmission can be effected. The machinery must be such as to allow the transformation and transmission of electrical energy under highly economic and practical conditions. Furthermore, an inducement must be offered to those who are engaged in the industrial exploitation of natural sources of power, as waterfalls, by guaranteeing greater returns on the capital invested than they can secure by local development of the property. From that moment when it was observed that, contrary to the established opinion, low and easily accessible strata of the atmosphere are capable of conducting electricity, the transmission of electrical energy without wires has become a rational task of the engineer, and one surpassing all others in importance. Its practical consummation would mean that energy would be available for the uses of man at any point of the globe, not in small amounts such as might be derived from the ambient medium by suitable machinery, but in quantities virtually unlimited from waterfalls. Export of power would then become the chief source of income from many happily situated countries, as the United States, Canada, Central and South America, Switzerland, and Sweden. Men could settle down everywhere, fertilize and irrigate the soil with little effort, and convert barren deserts into gardens, and thus the entire globe could be transformed and made a fitter abode for mankind. It is highly probable that if there are intelligent beings on Mars, they have long ago realized this very idea, which would explain the changes on its surface noted by astronomers. The atmosphere on that planet, being of considerably smaller density than that of Earth, would make the task much more easy. It is probable that we shall soon have a self-acting heat engine capable of deriving moderate amounts of energy from the ambient medium. There is also a possibility, though a small one, that we may obtain electrical energy directly from the sun. This might be the case if the Maxwellian theory is true, according to which electrical vibration of all rates should emanate from the sun. I am still investigating this subject. Sir William Crookes has shown in his beautiful invention known as the radiometer that rays may produce by impact a mechanical effect, and this may lead to some important revelation as to the utilization of the sun's rays in novel ways. Other sources of energy may be opened up, and new methods of deriving energy from the sun discovered, but none of these or similar achievements would equal in importance to the transmission of power to any distance through the medium. I can conceive of no technical advance which would tend to unite the various elements of humanity more effectively than this one, or of one which would more add to or more economize human energy. It would be the best means of increasing the force accelerating the human mass. The mere moral influence of such a radical departure would be incalculable. On the other hand, if at any point of the globe energy can be obtained in limited quantities from the ambient medium by means of a self-acting heat engine or otherwise, the conditions will remain the same as before. Human performance will be increased, but men will remain strangers as they were. I anticipate that, unprepared for these results, which, through a long familiarity, appear to me simple and obvious, will consider them still far from practical application. Such reserve, and even opposition, of some is as useful a quality and as necessary an element in human progress as the quick receptivity and enthusiasm of others. Thus, a mass which resists the force at first, once set in movement, adds to the energy. The scientific man does not aim at an immediate result. He does not expect that his advanced ideas will be readily taken up. His work is like that of a planter, for the future. His duty is to lay the foundation for those who are to come and point the way. He lives and labors and hopes with the poet who says, "Daily work, my hand's employment, to complete is pure enjoyment. Let me never falter. No, there is no empty dreaming. Lo, these trees, but bare poles seeming, yet will yield both food and shelter." Goethe's Hope.